Hi, this is Brendan Davis from Bedrock Games, and today I want to talk about spontaneous curses, magic, and spirited weapons. What I mean by that is the idea of if you're a game master and you do something like you create a magical artifact and you come up with a backstory for how the artifact came to be, and you don't necessarily consider um, the mechanical steps of how it arrived there. You think of it in terms of the history, in terms of, okay, this was possessed by this king, and then the king butchered his family, and so his hate and anger was fused into the blade, and it gave it life and a personality and power. And so now there's magic in this sword. And you usually, I find most game masters start with the flavor and then they layer the mechanics on after. And sometimes you can be reluctant to do that with things that occur around player characters themselves. So, and this isn't just about magic weapons. This is about anything from something like a ghost emerging, like or a curse developing. So, to give some examples from my own campaigns, I had one player who basically used a special ability to make another character fall in love with him, another NPC fall in love with him, and then he murdered that NPC. And the way that he did it, it was really number one, it was exceptionally cruel the way it was done. Number two, the NPC was fanatically in love with this player, and and then when he did it, he said something about meeting the NPC in the next life, and so it just seemed, given what I knew of the cosmology of the setting, that NPC would come back as a ghost and haunt the player character. I didn't need to consult a chart or the system to see if I knew that that's what would happen in the setting. Another example would be, I have a character who I mentioned in the other video that I did, who's been executing people with a really massive mace. He's just like, every time he kills somebody, he does it with his mace, and he smashes them in the head. And this isn't necessarily going to happen, but he's done this so much that I would think at a certain point, it's not inconceivable this weapon would develop some kind of spirit or personality or magic around those activities, that would start to take on a magical quality, again, given the cosmology of the setting. This isn't going to apply to every setting. If you're doing like a modern day gangster thing, that's not going to apply. In certain fantasy settings, it might, or it might not, depending on how things work. Um, but I think being able to sort of identify when those things arise in game and play upon them is important. I think it's also important not to go overboard. I think you need to have sort of principles that you apply to, you know, when something like this would emerge. Uh, but by doing it, I don't know. I find it really, it connects the player characters to the setting in a way they might not be. It's just, you have to make sure that you aren't doing sort of the, I guess you could call it the rule of cool. If you're doing it just because it's cool, I find after a while players tend to resent that, or they tend to pick up on it, and they don't like it because it feels like, well, it's inevitable. It's happening because the GM thinks it's a good story development. So I try to really root it in the cosmology, in the rules of the cosmology, or at least what I understand them to be. And I always have those kind of rules floating around in my head. So so again, in this case, the fact that you have a character who's bashing people in the head with a mace and killing them brutally, I can see how how something might emerge out of that in this setting. I haven't made a decision on that one. That's probably not going to in fact occur, but it was just an example that leapt to mind. The character that murdered the NPC after making the NPC fall in love with him, that was a no brainer. That's obviously going to happen. But but again, I think it really does. You have to be cautious, and you have to be careful in how you apply these things. The same thing with curses. I mean, if curses are a thing in the setting, you know, somebody might curse a player character if they've been killed, or if they've been if the player characters have wronged them. If ideally you have a method in the game that deals with, like, there's rituals or things like that. But I think even then, there's always those edge cases where you might have a ritual system where you make a talisman and you can try to levy a curse on somebody or something. But if you have gods, if you have bigger supernatural powers that can be invoked, there's always the possibility of going around those things, of something being significant enough that the gods themselves get involved, or that fate gets involved and imposes something on people. So I always like to be open to that, but I like to make sure that I'm doing it with certain principles in mind about the how the cosmology works, how why these things would occur. Like if there's a set of principles that the supreme god or goddess would adjudicate these things on, or if there are certain taboos that if you break them, no matter what, something bad is going to happen to you. So I think again, ideally these are in the system. Most systems fall short at some point on this front, or they're open enough that you have to make the call yourself. I prefer systems to be open enough that I can insert this as needed. But usually I try to bake as much of this into my own system as possible. But again, you never get everything. It's never, you can never capture every possible situation and event. But yeah, so I guess the point is, I find that is to not overlook these kinds of developments just because they're happening around player characters. There are all these things happen a lot with NPCs and items and stuff that are sort of off screen with that are maybe part of the adventure or part of the backstory to an adventure. But a lot of times it's easy to not bring them in when player characters themselves do it. So my rule of thumb is if a king can be cursed by the gods for doing something, then so can a player character. It just has to rise to that level. And I think being able to sort of play the cosmos, play the world, including the gods, including any supernatural forces, is really important if you want to do that. So I think the more you sort of think about your supernatural aspects, the more you sort of try to get a handle on how the gods behave, how supernatural forces and principles behave, how things like taboos actually interact with that, if they're just man-made, or if they're if there's some physics in the setting that's being violated when you breach a taboo that almost sets off an alarm. So as an example of this, you see this in like the Ravenloft system with the powers checks. That's kind of what those are. They're triggers that set off the dark powers tendrils, and I think it's a very clear cosmology to work with as a GM, and I try to do that in any cosmology that I'm running. Provided there is a supernatural aspect. If you're running a game that's barren of any supernatural, then that's a different story. But games where you have it, I think it's important to play it and simulate it as best you can. So anyways, those are my thoughts on that subject. I'm sorry if they're rambling. I haven't been doing these videos quite as much lately because I've been working on some modules and stuff. So I do hope to be on in the near future with some of my reviews and my normal types of videos. But I wanted to get this out there because I just kind of thought about this morning and was thinking about it for one of my own campaigns and how this comes up a lot. But I had never really talked about it. So all right, I will talk to you later.